I love kombucha, and if you're watching this video, you probably love kombucha too. As you may know, drinking kombucha every day can get pretty expensive. I'm going to show you how to make it for around 50 cents a bottle, so it'll save you money.
Welcome to
Drink! Kombucha is a fermented drink that undergoes two fermentations. The first fermentation is the starter culture, also known as the mother, and the second fermentation is the bottling. For the first fermentation, you will need 3 large glass jars, a tea of your choice as long as it's not flavored, and some sugar. For the second fermentation, you'll need some type of flavoring. I usually use lemon and ginger. You'll need liquid from the starter culture, 8 resealable bottles, and it would help to have a funnel and a chopstick. During these fermentations, it's really important to have your equipment as sterile as possible, and this includes your hands. To begin the first fermentation, I'll be using these wide mouth mason jars. I like the wide mouth because I feel like during the fermentation process, it gives the kombucha room to breathe. And I'll fill them with tea, sugar, and what's called a SCOBY. Now, the most important ingredient in making kombucha is what's known as SCOBY, or the mother. And SCOBY stands for symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast. Now, you can buy a SCOBY online, or you can get it from somebody who makes kombucha themselves, or you can grow your own, which if you stick around till the end of this video, I'll show you how to do so. Temperature is a major factor in making kombucha. It loves to live between 70 and 73 degrees, but I've had a lot of success with it between 65 and 85. The warmer it is, the quicker it gets done, the more of it you can have, and the colder it is, it's a little bit more slow going. But there's a few steps that I do several hours ahead of time, just so I don't have to worry about the temperature being too hot or too cold. I'll boil some water and pick out my tea. They say that black tea is best at activating the SCOBY. I like decaf. And I usually put, for my batch, 2 family-sized tea bags in there. I think that equates to about 10 small tea bags. Then I'll add a cup of sugar. And when this starts boiling, I'll just add enough boiling water to dissolve that sugar. I don't want to add a whole bunch of water because I'm going to have to wait that much longer before I can start my kombucha process. Next, I fill a mason jar full of water to add to the tea. And I do this step now so that I don't have to fiddle with a thermometer to get my tap at the right temperature. At this point, I'm going to get any flavorings I'm going to use out of the refrigerator or the freezer. And then I just wait for everything to come to room temperature. Everything's now at room temperature, and I didn't get a chance to finish it yesterday. I'm going to add the tea to these 2 jars evenly, and then we'll add our SCOBY. I use 2 jars just in case the SCOBY gets compromised, gets any mold on it, then I'll just go ahead and throw it away. The other thing you can do is make a SCOBY hotel, and I'll show you how to do that at the end of the video when I show you how to grow your own SCOBY. So at this point, I'll be looking at the health of my SCOBY. So a healthy SCOBY is going to be firm and lighter in color, and an old dying SCOBY is going to be kind of mushy and not have that firmness. I'm going to get an even amount of SCOBY in each jar, and so to do that I can just peel it apart. You can cut it, just make sure your scissors are sterile, and we'll probably get rid of this dying SCOBY. The rest looks pretty good. Now we're ready to put it all together. First, to our tea, I'll add an even amount of SCOBY. Then I'll add whatever's left in here, about a half a cup. And if there's not a half a cup, here's the first fermentation that's already mature that I pulled the SCOBY from. So I'll add just a little bit more from each in there. This just helps the first fermentation along a little better, I think. Keeps it's full of bacteria and yeast. Then I'll add last the room temperature water, and I'll fill it all the way up. Lastly, I put these coffee filters on. That allows the kombucha to breathe, but keeps any contaminants or dust out. And then I'll label it with the date. So after I date them, I'll be sure to put them in a dark space. Again, the temperature ranging between 65 and 85. And then I'll look at it probably after a good full 3 days and test it out. And this is how I test it out. And to prevent any contamination, I use a straw. Stir it up a little bit, get a sample, and give it a taste. Now, if it tastes too sweet, then it needs a little bit more time, and I'll test it in a few days again. And if it's too vinegary, well, it's gone too far and I've got to throw it out. But right in between is when you want to fermentate the second time, and that's when you bottle it. Perfect. I use 8 resealable glass bottles. You can use or reuse other bottles, but you just want to be sure it has a tight seal. During the second fermentation, CO2 builds up in the bottle, and if it's not a tight seal, then it'll explode kombucha everywhere. I use these Grosh bottles. I got them online, and they've held up for a good couple of years. Now I'll need to clean the bottles. I use something called Star Sand, and I'll have the link below. I'll dilute it and pour it into a tub here. Then I'll soak each bottle for about a minute each. So after about a minute, I'll put on these gloves. The Star Sand diluted is food safe, but it's kind of an acid, so I want to make sure to protect my hands. I'll use a bottle brush, and I bent it where the neck of the bottle, that's where a lot of the debris ends up. When I'm done with my kombucha, I pretty much just rinse them. I don't clean them really well, and I wait to clean them really well during this process. Now, as you can see, after I've cleaned it, it's got all those bubbles. Don't worry about those bubbles. They're perfectly fine. The more you try to rinse them, the more they will not go away. I also take the tops off and clean that as well. Now we add the ingredients. First I'll add sugar, a tablespoon per bottle. And I add the sugar first because the rest of the ingredients are wet. And if I add the sugar after the wet ingredients, it just clumps up in the funnel. Next I'll add some freshly squeezed lemon. And I'll add about a tablespoon per bottle as well. About 2 lemons gives me 8 tablespoons for this batch. Now I'm going to add the ginger, and we're going to need 1 tablespoon per bottle. We've got 8 bottles, so that's a total of 8 tablespoons. Now to get the ginger to this state, I bought some ginger root, put it through a food processor. I didn't even have to peel it. And then I got a muffin pan, and I measured 8 tablespoons per muffin, put it in the freezer, and then when that was done freezing, I put it in a freezer bag to where all I have to do is get a muffin out, thaw it, and then measure it out. Now it's kind of a pain to measure out 8 tablespoons perfectly, so I just kind of make 8 little clumps, and that's what we'll add to each bottle. So now to add the ginger, I'll just plop a clump in there, and I'll add a little bit of our first fermentation kombucha just to help it down the funnel. And that's where our chopstick comes into play. It just kind of pushes it all down. And I'll do that to each bottle. Now adding your flavorings to your kombucha is an experiment in itself. If you've got juice that you're adding, then that's got sugar, so you may not need to add sugar at all. Or if it doesn't have enough sugar, it's going to slow down your process. So you'll just kind of have to play with it. Now I'll mix each of these jars. There's a lot of milky stuff that gets built up on the bottom, all that good stuff. And then I'll evenly pour them into each bottle as much as I can. I'll fill each one to about the base of the neck, and I want to leave some room for the CO2 buildup. In my research, I've heard it's about 1 to 1.5 inches at least. And then I'll go ahead and wipe any debris off the top, make sure it's on evenly, and seal. Then I'll place them in a sealed box just in case there's any explosions. And after about 3-4 days, I go and check on them. So here's a batch I've had sitting for about 4 days, and I'm ready to test it. If I open it and it's nice and fizzy, then I'll put it in the fridge, and that'll stop the fermentation process. If I open it and it's not fizzy, I'll just leave it in here to give it a few more days. And at that point, if I open it and it's not fizzy, I feel like it's spoiled and I just don't drink it. But be careful when you open this, because it could explode. Oh, and that's a dud, so I'll let it sit for a few more days. Let's try another one. Oh yeah, that's a good one. Oh.
It's gonna pop.
Now, as promised, I'm going to show you how to make a SCOBY. You're going to follow the instructions as the first fermentation by adding sugar, tea, and water to a mason jar. But since you don't have a SCOBY, you'll buy a bottle of kombucha from the store and add that. Next, place something that'll keep debris out. something that'll keep it in place, and after about a month you'll see your SCOBY on top there, and you'll be ready to make your first batch of kombucha. So your SCOBY may free float all around, and that's perfectly fine. Another neat concept that uses a SCOBY is apple cider vinegar, and I'll be doing a video about that in the future, so make sure you subscribe to get notified. So if you ever want to take a break from making kombucha but don't want to give up your SCOBY, you can make something called a SCOBY hotel. Get a jar and add your first fermentation along with the SCOBY and seal it with a lid to prevent any evaporation. Check on it about once a month, and if it looks like it needs some nourishment, you can add a little bit of kombucha from a store-bought jar, or you can add some sugar.